The storm hit Zarian 7 like the wrath of angry gods, turning the amber sky black and sending crystalline debris spinning through the air with lethal force. Cale pressed his face against the reinforced viewport of his workshop, watching nature's fury tear across the desolate landscape. Lightning, if the electromagnetic discharges could be called that, painted everything in harsh, strobing whites and blues. He'd chosen this isolation for good reason. No military patrols, no colonial oversight, no reminders of the war that had consumed half the galaxy. Just him, his tools, and the endless stream of broken machinery that found its way to his door. The frontier had a way of breaking things, and Cale had a gift for putting them back together. The impact against his outer door came during a brief lull in the storm's screaming. At first he thought it was debris, chunks of meteor or twisted metal carried by the wind. But the sound came again, weaker this time, almost deliberate. Cale grabbed his plasma cutter and emergency beacon before cycling through the airlock. The storm tried to tear him apart the moment he stepped outside, driving needle-sharp particles against his environmental suit. He nearly missed her in the swirling chaos, a crumpled form pressed against his workshop's foundation, barely visible through the atmospheric distortion. She wasn't human. Even unconscious and battered, her alien nature was unmistakable. Silver skin that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, despite being slicked with some kind of dark fluid. Blood, he realized with a start. Her limbs were proportioned like a human's, but longer, more elegant. Strange markings traced patterns across her visible skin, currently dim but suggesting they might normally glow. Most striking were her features. Even unconscious, her face held an otherworldly beauty. Sharp cheekbones, a delicate nose, and lips that seemed almost human until you noticed how they curved just slightly wrong. Her hair, plastered against her skull by the storm, appeared to shift between deep purple and midnight blue. An Alteran. Had to be. He'd seen enough propaganda images during the war to recognize the species, though he'd never encountered one, in person. Most humans hadn't. The two species had been trying to annihilate each other for the better part of a decade. For a moment, Kyle hesitated. Harboring an enemy alien was treason of the highest order. But then another gust of wind drove crystalline shards against his visor, and he saw fresh blood seeping from a gash along her ribcage. Whatever else she might be, she was dying. The decision made itself. Getting her inside proved challenging. She was taller than him and completely limp, her alien physiology making it difficult to find secure grips. By the time he managed to drag her through the airlock and onto his workshop floor, both of them were covered in a mixture of her blood and the storm's detritus. Cale's medical supplies were limited. Frontier mechanics didn't typically stock trauma gear for xenobiology. But anatomy was anatomy, and bleeding was bleeding. He worked methodically, cleaning wounds and applying synth skin patches where he could. Her skin felt warm, almost fevered, and those strange markings pulsed faintly with each heartbeat. The worst injury was along her left side, a deep laceration that had barely missed vital organs. As he worked to seal it, Kyle found himself studying her face. Without the distortion of fear or propaganda, she looked peaceful, vulnerable, young. Even by human standards, hours passed. The storm gradually exhausted itself, its fury diminishing to occasional gusts and the steady patter of settling debris. Kyle had moved her to his small living area, arranging cushions and blankets into a makeshift bed. Her breathing had stabilized, and the bleeding had stopped. Now came the waiting. He dozed fitfully in his chair, plasma cutter within easy reach, old habits from the war, never sleep deeply around potential threats. But every time he looked at her, the precaution felt more foolish. She looked like she'd barely survived whatever had brought her to his doorstep. Dawn came pale and hesitant through the workshop's viewports. Cale was checking her bandages when her eyes opened. They were extraordinary, crystalline blue with flecks of silver that seemed to swirl and dance. For a moment, they held the unfocused look of someone swimming up from unconsciousness. Then, awareness flooded in and she saw him. The scream that tore from her throat was pure terror, raw, primal, and heartbreaking. She tried to scramble backward, forgetting her injuries, and collapsed as pain lanced through her side. Her eyes never left his face, wide with a fear so profound it seemed to consume her entirely. "Please," Kyle said, raising his hands slowly, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe." But she didn't understand his words, and even if she had, Kyle realized with growing certainty that his assurances meant nothing. She wasn't just afraid, she was terrified of him specifically, of what he was, of the fact that he was human. The realization hit him like a physical blow. In all his years of isolation, he'd almost forgotten the propaganda, the stories both sides told about each other. To her, he wasn't a lonely mechanic who'd saved her life. He was a monster from her people's darkest nightmares, and now they were trapped together with nowhere to run and a galaxy of hatred standing between them. 3 days passed in careful, tension-filled coexistence. Vesa, he'd learned her name through painstaking gestures and the Universal Translator app on his datapad, remained curled in the corner of his living space, watching his every movement with those crystalline eyes. She accepted water and the nutrient pastes he offered, but flinched whenever he came too close. Kale had given up trying to check her bandages. Every approach sent her into near panic, despite the obvious pain she was experiencing. Instead, he focused on making himself seem as non-threatening as possible, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible, speaking in soft tones even though she couldn't understand him. "The storm's passed," he said during their morning ritual of shared silence. The translator flickered to life, converting his words into the melodic tones of Alteran. "Your ship? Was there a ship? I could help you signal for rescue." Her response came haltingly through the device, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "No ship. Escape pod. Crashed. In the wastes." She paused, studying his face as if searching for deception. "Why do you not kill me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Kale set down his morning ration and leaned back in his chair, maintaining distance. "Why would I kill you? You are human." The translator couldn't convey the full weight she put into that word, but Kale heard it anyway. "Humans are destroyers, killers of worlds, the burning ones." "The burning ones?" Kale frowned. "Is that what your people call us?" Vesa's markings flickered, a sign of agitation he was learning to recognize. "In the Third Spiral War, humans glassed 7 of our colony worlds. Billions dead. Children, elders, artists, all burned to nothing." Her voice carried the cadence of someone reciting a well-memorized lesson. "Before that, the trade wars. Before that, first contact. Always the same. Humans take, humans destroy, humans burn." The litany of accusations settled heavily in the small room. Kyle recognized some of the events, though he suspected the details had been altered in the telling as they always were in war. Both sides had their atrocities, their justifications, their martyrs. "I wasn't in any of those wars," he said quietly. "I refused to fight." Her markings pulsed brighter, confusion clear in her expression. "Refused?" "Humans who refuse to fight are killed, executed for cowardice. Some are. I was lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. They exiled me instead." Kale gestured toward the workshop beyond. "Sent me out here to fix things instead of breaking them." For the first time since awakening, Vesa seemed to really look at him, not as a monster from her nightmares, but as an individual. Her gaze traced the old scar along his jaw, the calloused hands that spoke of honest work, the tired eyes that held no malice. "You tend wounds instead of making them," she said slowly, as if testing the words. "It's what I do, fix things that are broken." He met her gaze steadily, "including wounded aliens who collapse outside my door." The translator remained silent for long moments as she processed this. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a note of wonder. "The stories. They say humans cannot feel compassion, that you are made only for war and conquest. And what do your stories say about your people? That we are peaceful, builders of beauty, guardians of wisdom." The markings along her arms dimmed slightly. "But I have seen Alteran warriors too. I have seen what we do when we fight. It was a crack in the wall of propaganda she'd been raised behind. Kale recognized the moment for what it was, dangerous and precious both. Push too hard, and she'd retreat back into familiar hatred. But perhaps, if he was careful. What did you do before the escape pod? I was a cultural attaché, learning about other species for the Council of Memories. She touched her throat, where her translator device had been damaged. I was returning from the Helix Nebula when pirates attacked our convoy. Human pirates, she added, watching for his reaction. There are human pirates, yes. There are also Alterran ones, Centauri smugglers, vegan slavers. The frontier attracts all kinds. Kale kept his voice neutral. What happened to your ship? Destroyed. Most of the crew. Most died. Her voice caught. I made it to an escape pod, but the navigation was damaged. I've been drifting for weeks, maybe months. When I saw this planet, she gestured weakly. I thought I would die here. You nearly did. The storm almost killed you before you reached my door. They fell silent again. But it was a different quality of silence now. Less charged with fear, more weighted with possibility. Vessa's position had shifted slightly, no longer pressed quite so desperately into the corner. Her breathing was easier. Why do you live alone? She asked eventually. Because it's easier than living with people who see me as a traitor. Kale's smile held no humor, and because broken things don't judge you for your past. Are you broken? The question was asked with such genuine curiosity that Kale found himself considering it seriously. Maybe. Or maybe I was the only one who wasn't broken enough to keep fighting a war that should have ended decades ago. Vessa's markings began to pulse in a slow, rhythmic pattern he hadn't seen before. Something thoughtful, almost hypnotic. The elders say the war continues because humans cannot know peace, that it is not in your nature. What do you think now? She studied him for a long moment, those crystalline eyes seeming to look deeper than his surface. I think the elders have never met you. It wasn't much, barely a crack in a lifetime of conditioning, but it was a beginning. And for the first time since finding her outside his door, Kale allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could both be more than the sum of their species' hatred. Outside, Xerion 7's twin suns were setting, painting the workshop in shades of amber and gold. Inside, two beings from warring peoples sat in careful, tentative peace, and began the slow work of seeing each other as more than enemies. 2 weeks had transformed the dynamic between them entirely. Vessa now moved freely through Kale's workshop, her natural curiosity overcoming cycles of indoctrinated fear. She watched him work with fascination, asking questions about his techniques and tools through the increasingly sophisticated conversations their shared translator enabled. Your hands, she observed one afternoon, settling beside his workbench as he repaired a damaged atmospheric processor. They're very precise. Gentle. Kyle glanced up from the delicate circuitry he was rewiring. Vessa sat close enough that he could see the intricate patterns of her markings as they shifted from pale silver to soft blue. Something he'd learned indicated contentment. Her injuries had healed remarkably quickly, leaving only faint lines where the worst cuts had been. You have to be gentle with broken things, he said, returning to his work. Force them, and they break worse. Is that why you're gentle with me? The question made him pause, his hands stilling over the component array. There was something different in her tone. Not the cautious curiosity of their early conversations, but something warmer, more personal. You were never broken, he said, carefully. Just hurt and afraid. Vessa's markings rippled in what he'd learned was the equivalent of a smile. I was terrified. When I first saw you, I thought, she shook her head. The stories we tell about humans, they're so vivid, so detailed. I could see every nightmare scenario playing out. And now? Now I think our storytellers have very poor imaginations. She reached out tentatively, her fingers hovering near his hand. "May I?" Kyle nodded, setting down his tools. Her touch was electric. Literally, he realized, as tiny sparks of bioluminescence danced across her fingertips where they met his skin. Her hands were longer than his, more delicate but surprisingly strong. "Your skin is so warm," she murmured, tracing the lines of his palm. "And these marks, scars from your work?" "Mostly. Plasma cutters and power tools don't forgive mistakes." He found himself studying her face as she examined his hands. Without fear twisting her features, she was breathtaking in an alien way that defied human standards of beauty, while somehow transcending them entirely. "We have a concept," Vesa said softly, "called Velthara. It means the beauty found in things that bear the marks of purpose, tools worn smooth by skilled hands, art that shows the artist's struggle, bodies that carry the evidence of meaningful work." Her luminescent markings pulsed gently. "I think humans must have something similar." "Character," Kale said. "We'd call it character." "Yes." Her fingers moved from his hands to trace the scar along his jaw, the one he'd earned in his last official military action, trying to evacuate civilians from a bombing zone. "This has character too." The touch sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with her bioelectric field. He found himself leaning into the contact, starved for gentleness after years of solitude. When had he last been touched with such care? "Vesa," he began, then stopped, unsure what he'd meant to say. She seemed to understand anyway. Her hand cupped his cheek, thumb brushing across his cheekbone. "I know. I feel it too. This impossible thing growing between us." Her voice carried a note of wonder. "My people would call it madness, yours probably worse. My people cast me out for refusing to kill yours. I stopped caring what they thought a long time ago. And yet you care what I think." It wasn't a question. Kyle nodded anyway, caught by the intensity in her crystalline eyes. "More than I should? Probably. Why shouldn't you?" The question was barely a whisper. "Because I'm Alteran? Because we're supposed to be enemies? Because everything we've been taught says this is wrong? All of that." "What if everything we've been taught is wrong?" She shifted closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "What if the only truth that matters is what we choose to believe about each other?" The workshop had fallen silent around them, the only sound the gentle hum of recycling systems and their own breathing. Kale could smell something like ozone and starlight on her skin. Alien, but not unpleasant. Intoxicating, actually. "Vesa, She silenced him by pressing her forehead against his, a gesture that seemed intimate beyond words. "You saved my life. You showed me kindness when everything I'd been taught said you should show me only cruelty. You've been patient with my fears, gentle with my healing." Her markings began to glow brighter, casting them both in soft silver light. "If that's not worth believing in, what is?" The kiss, when it came, was hesitant at first, two beings navigating the differences between their species. But hesitation melted into certainty as they discovered that some things transcended biology. Her lips were softer than human ones, and there was a faint tingle where they touched, as if she carried starlight in her very breath. When they broke apart, both were breathing harder. Vesa's markings had taken on a warm golden hue he'd never seen before, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Is this real?" she whispered against his lips. "I don't know," Kyle admitted, "but it's the most real thing I've felt in years." Outside, Zarian 7's harsh winds carried the scent of distant storms. Inside, two hearts that should have been enemies began beating in synchrony, discovering that love, like the finest repairs, required both courage and the willingness to be gentle with broken things, including themselves. The nights on Zarian 7 stretched long and cold, but Kale's workshop had become a haven of warmth. 3 weeks had passed since their first kiss, and the careful distance they'd maintained was slowly crumbling under the weight of growing desire and deepening trust. Vesa had taken to sleeping in his bed rather than the makeshift cushions in the corner, a change that had evolved naturally from shared meals to shared conversations that lasted deep into the night. Tonight she lay beside him in the darkness, her markings providing a soft, pulsing glow that painted intricate patterns on the ceiling. "Tell me about loneliness," she said quietly, her head resting on his shoulder. Cale's arm tightened around her. "What do you want to know?" "How you lived with it for so long, before I came here." Her fingers traced idle patterns on his chest. "Among my people, solitude is unnatural. We're deeply social beings. The longest I'd ever been alone before the escape pod was perhaps a day." "You learn to fill the silence," Kyle said. "Work helps, projects that require focus, but there's always a part of you that's waiting, listening for something that never comes. And now? Now I can't imagine silence without you in it." She lifted her head to look at him, her crystalline eyes reflecting starlight from the viewport. "That's either very romantic or very frightening. Both, probably." Vesa smiled, an expression he'd become addicted to watching. When she smiled, her markings shifted to warm gold, and her entire face seemed to glow from within. "I've been thinking about what happens when the supply ship comes." Cale's chest tightened. The automated supply drop was due in less than a week, his quarterly delivery of parts and provisions. With it would come the possibility of communication with the wider galaxy, of rescue for Vesa. "You'll want to contact your people," he said, carefully. "Will I?" She shifted, propping herself up on one elbow. "What if I told them I'd found something here worth staying for? They'd think you'd lost your mind. Probably send a medical team. Probably." Her hand found his cheek, thumb, tracing the line of his jaw. "What if I told you I didn't care what they thought?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that made Cale's heart race. "Vesa, I know what I'm saying." Her voice was steady, certain. "I know what I'd be giving up, but I also know what I'd be gaining. It wouldn't be easy. Two different species trying to build something together. The biology alone." She silenced him with a kiss, deeper than any they'd shared before. When she pulled back, her markings were blazing golden white. "Do you want me to stay?" "More than anything." "Then show me." The invitation was clear, and Cale felt his last reservations crumble. "Are you sure? We don't know what—" "I'm sure." Her hands moved to his shirt, fingers working at the fastenings. "I've never been more sure of anything." What followed was a careful exploration of desire across species lines. Vesa's skin was incredibly sensitive, responding to the lightest touch with cascades of bioluminescent patterns. She gasped when he traced the markings along her collarbone, her back arching as they flared brilliant blue. "You're beautiful," he whispered against her throat, tasting starlight on her skin. Her response was wordless, communicated through touch and the shifting colors of her markings. She explored him with equal wonder, mapping the scars and calluses that told the story of his life. When she pressed her lips to the old wound on his shoulder, earned trying to save Alteran civilians during a border skirmish, tears gathered in her eyes. "So much pain," she murmured. "So much loneliness." Not anymore. Their joining was tentative at first, both aware they were crossing into uncharted territory. But biology proved adaptable, and what began as careful experimentation evolved into passionate connection. Vesa's markings reached crescendo brightness, bathing them both in waves of silver and gold. Her cries of pleasure harmonized with his, creating music that had never existed before in the universe. Afterward, they lay entwined, her head on his chest, listening to the dual rhythm of their heartbeats. The markings along her arms and shoulders had settled into a soft, steady glow, contentment made visible. "That was—" she began, then laughed softly. "I don't think either of our languages has words for what that was." "Perfect?" Kyle suggested, running his fingers through her color-shifting hair. "Beyond perfect. Transcendent." She tilted her head to look at him. "Is it always like that between humans?" "No. Not even close. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I think what we just shared was uniquely ours. They talked through the night, sharing secrets and dreams, mapping the landscape of a future they were beginning to believe might be possible. When dawn came through the workshop viewports, they made love again, slower this time, savoring each touch and sensation. It was during their lazy morning aftermath that the proximity alarms began to sound. Kale was at the monitors in seconds, Vesa close behind him. The readings were clear. A ship was approaching, running fast and silent. Not the automated supply drone they'd been expecting. Military configuration, Kyle said grimly, studying the sensor data. Alteran design. Vesa's markings had gone pale, almost colorless. They found me. How? The escape pod probably had a delayed distress beacon. Or they've been searching. She turned to him, desperation clear in her crystalline eyes. They'll take me home, and if they find out about us, the implications hung unspoken between them. Fraternization with enemy species was treason for both their peoples. For Vesa, it might mean re-education or exile. For Kale, it would mean death. We run, he said simply. Where? This is a frontier world. There's nowhere to. Trust me. Kale was already moving, pulling on clothes, gathering essential supplies. I've got a ship hidden in the northern canyons, old smuggler's trick. Always have an exit strategy. Vesa stared at him for a moment, weighing her options. Then her markings flared bright with determination. What do we need? As they prepared for flight, abandoning the only home either had known in years, Kale realized that love wasn't just about finding someone worth staying for. Sometimes it was about finding someone worth running with. And as Vesa's people descended from the sky like vengeful stars, two lovers prepared to flee into the vast unknown, carrying nothing but each other and the impossible hope that somewhere, in the galaxy, there might be a place for love to exist beyond the boundaries of species and war. 6 months after fleeing Xerion 7, Kale guided their salvaged freighter through the asteroid field surrounding Kepler 442c, a world so remote it didn't appear on most star charts. Beside him, Vesa monitored the navigation array, her markings pulsing in the deep blue patterns that indicated intense concentration. There, she said, pointing to a break in the asteroid debris. The signal's strongest in that direction. They'd been following rumors for weeks, whispers of a settlement in the outer rim where species boundaries mattered less than survival skills. A place called Haven's Rest, built in the ruins of an ancient alien city, where refugees from a dozen different conflicts had found sanctuary. Think it's real? Kale asked as their ship threaded between massive chunks of space rock. It has to be. Vesa's hand found his on the control stick, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. Because if it's not, we're running out of places to hide. The past months had been a blur of close calls and narrow escapes. Vesa's people had branded her a traitor, issuing bounties that made her a target for every mercenary in 3 sectors. Kale's status as a human consorting with an enemy alien made him equally valuable and equally hunted. They'd survived on salvage work and black market repairs, always staying one step ahead of both Alteran pursuit ships and human military patrols. But they'd survived together, and that made all the difference. The planet's surface resolved into view as they cleared the asteroid field. A world of crystalline formations and impossible architecture that spoke of builders far older and more advanced than either human or Alteran civilization. Nestled in a valley between 2 massive spires was a sprawling settlement that seemed to grow organically from the alien landscape. Haven's Rest, Vesa whispered, her markings shifting to the warm gold that indicated wonder. The landing pad they were directed to buzzed with activity, beings from dozens of species working alongside each other with casual cooperation. Kale spotted humans, Alterans, the insectoid Veltar, even a few of the rare ethereal ones whose crystalline bodies bent light in impossible ways. Their ship had barely powered down when they were approached by a delegation that could have been pulled from a xenobiology textbook. Leading them was a tall woman with the blue-tinted skin of a Centauri native, flanked by a grizzled human man and an Alteran whose markings bore the ceremonial scars of a former military officer. "Welcome to Haven's Rest," the Centauri woman said, her translator converting her words into both human standard and Alteran musical tones. "I'm Administrator Chen Cavell. We've been expecting you." Kale and Vesa exchanged glances. "Expecting us? Word travels fast in the Outer Rim," the human man said with a grin that revealed too many teeth. "Story of a human mechanic and an Alteran cultural attaché running from both their governments? That's the kind of romance that makes for good bar tales." The Alteran officer stepped forward and Vesa tensed, old instincts flaring. But instead of hostility, his markings showed respectful greeting. "I am Thon Velmar, formerly of the Alteran Fourth Fleet. I defected 3 years ago when I could no longer stomach what we were doing to human civilians." He gestured toward the human beside him. Marcus here was a colonial marine until he decided saving lives was more important than taking them. "The point being," Administrator Chen Cavell continued, "that Haven's Rest exists for people like you. People who've chosen love over hatred, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair." The tour that followed was a revelation. The settlement had been built within and around the ruins of an ancient city. Its original builders long gone, but their architecture adapted to serve new purposes. Humans and Alterans worked side by side in workshops and laboratories. Mixed families, biological impossibilities made possible through advanced reproductive technology, played in gardens that bloomed with flora from a dozen worlds. "How?" Vesa asked, her voice full of wonder. "How do you make it work?" "Same way you two made it work," Marcus said with a knowing smile. "One day at a time, one choice at a time. One person deciding that the being next to them matters more than the propaganda they were raised on." They were assigned quarters in one of the residential spires, a space that was neither human nor Alteran but something entirely new, designed for inhabitants who had moved beyond such simple categories. That night, as they lay together in their new bed, Vesa traced patterns on Kyle's chest while her markings provided gentle illumination. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Everything we gave up to be here?" Kyle considered the question seriously. They'd lost their homes, their peoples, their old identities. They were fugitives and exiles, strangers in a strange land. But as he looked down at Vesa, at the love in her crystalline eyes, at the way her markings pulsed in sync with his heartbeat, he knew his answer. "Never," he said, pulling her closer. "Not for a second." "Good," she murmured against his lips, "because I have news that's going to make running away even more complicated." Something in her tone made him pull back to study her face. Her markings had taken on a new pattern he'd never seen before. Deep gold shot through with silver spirals that seemed to dance across her skin. "Vesa? The medical scanner I used yesterday? It detected something unexpected." Her smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. "Apparently, human and Alteran biology are more compatible than either species realized. We're going to have a baby." The news hit him like a physical force. A child. Their child, the first of its kind in the known galaxy, living proof that love could transcend not just species barriers but biological ones as well. How is that even possible? "I don't know. The doctor said it's unprecedented. A genetic miracle that shouldn't exist according to every textbook ever written." She pressed his hand to her still flat stomach. "But here it is anyway, growing inside me, a little piece of both our peoples, choosing to exist despite everything that says it shouldn't." Tears gathered in Kale's eyes as the full implications struck him. Their child would never face the choice between human and Alteran identity, because it would be both and neither. It would grow up in a place where such distinctions mattered less than character, less than the content of one's heart. It would be the future made flesh. 1 year later, as Kale held his daughter, her skin a beautiful blend of human warmth and Alteran luminescence, her eyes the same crystalline blue as her mother's, he watched through their quarter's viewport as more ships arrived at Haven's Rest. Refugees, defectors, lovers fleeing persecution, families seeking a place where their children could grow up free from the hatreds of the past. Vesa joined him at the window, their daughter cradled in her arms, her markings glowing with the deep contentment of a mother at peace. "Look at them all," she said softly. "Every ship bringing more people who chose love over war, hope over hatred." "Think we'll make it?" Kyle asked, wrapping his arms around his family. "Think this place will survive long enough for her to grow?" "Up here." Vesa leaned back against him, her markings pulsing in the rhythm that meant absolute certainty. "I think love is the most powerful force in the universe, and I think our daughter, and all the children like her, are going to prove that every species in the galaxy was wrong about what's possible." Outside their window, Haven's Rest continued to grow, a beacon of hope in a galaxy still torn by ancient hatreds. Inside their quarters, a family that shouldn't exist according to every law of biology and politics proved that the universe was far more wonderful and mysterious than anyone had dared to imagine. And in the soft glow of Alteran markings, mixed with human warmth, the future took its first breath and smiled. The end.